It all began with a single photograph. Faded, black and white, with edges curled from time. Two young boys stood barefoot in the dust, their arms stiff at their sides. Their mouths were slack, and their eyes were wrong. One looked slightly past the camera, while the other seemed to stare at nothing at all. Their faces were alike, but not quite identical. There was a lopsided quality to them, something you couldn't quite put your finger on. People once claimed they were born with the same soul, just split into unequal halves. But those who lived in that part of Appalachia and knew them better whispered a different tale, one steeped in old guilt and even older blood. Their grandfather, a man who hadn't spoken to another adult in over 2 decades, raised the twins. His cabin was nestled deep in a hollow outside Hyden, Kentucky, almost inaccessible by road. Locals say the land around it still feels heavy, as though the trees themselves are listening. That man, they claimed, was more shadow than flesh. There were no birth records, no marriage licenses, no name for him in the county books after 1921. But he had those boys, and he kept them hidden from the world like 2 secrets he never intended to reveal. What transpired in that cabin between 1938 and 1954 has never been officially documented. No police file survived, and no newspaper ever touched the story. Only rumors, letters that were later recovered, and a single case worker's report that vanished from state archives in 1973. Yet from those fragments, from those UN-sent letters discovered under a floorboard during a flood, a pattern started to emerge. A shape. A bloodline that bent too far inward. A grandfather who was raising not his grandsons, but his own sons. If you're still here, you're already looking too deep. But that's what you came for, isn't it? A glimpse into the family no one wanted to remember and the twins who weren't meant to survive. They were known simply as the boys, even well into their teenage years. No birth certificates, no school enrollment, no mention in church rosters, just whispered sightings. 2 pale figures seen on the edge of the tree line at dusk, standing motionless while their grandfather picked up mail every 2 weeks. A traveling merchant who sold tools in Leslie County claimed he saw them in 1949. He said they stared at him from the porch as if they had never seen a stranger before. Their faces, he described, were mirror images carved incorrectly, sloped foreheads and narrow, slanted eyes. One of them walked with a limp that didn't match any visible injury. The other blinked too slowly, as if it took a great effort. But it was more than just their appearance. It was their stillness. The merchant said they didn't fidget, speak, or smile, they just stared, as if something inside them had already turned to stone. This merchant brought the first outside suspicion. Following his visit, he wrote a letter to the county welfare office. It wasn't out of a sense of cruelty, he saw no chains or bruises, but because, as he put it, no child should look that empty. The letter, however, went unanswered. By then, Hayden was filled with forgotten people. Mining towns were collapsing, families were leaving, and roads were washing out. A call from a dirt-poor holler about strange twins didn't even make it to the bottom of the pile. What no one knew was what the merchant didn't see. The boys never left the house unless they were forced. The grandfather fed them in silence, sitting across the table with a rifle leaning against the wall. He spoke in ancient phrases, words they'd never heard from anyone else, calling them my repeats and telling them they were chosen. He never allowed them to look in mirrors, covering every reflective surface in burlap. He told them their faces weren't truly their own, that they came from a time before names, and the boys believed him. They had nothing else to believe in. No one else, no other world, just the cabin, the man, and each other. But even in silence, something always finds a way to leak out. One of the boys started writing scraps of thoughts, mostly carved with a nail into the underside of his bed. I was born too late, one fragment read. My brother cries without sound. We share the same night. It wasn't until 1953 that someone finally crossed the boundary. Her name was Evelyn Cross, a young woman from Louisville who was part of a failing outreach program meant to document and help Appalachian families living in extreme isolation. She was 24, idealistic, and far too trusting. County records show she hiked nearly 5 miles alone into the hollow after her driver refused to go any further down the washed-out road. Evelyn didn't leave much behind, just her journal, recovered years later at an estate sale in Harlem, and a handful of photographs. The pictures are haunting, grainy, out of focus, but unmistakable. 2 boys sit on the porch of a rotting cabin, their clothes several sizes too large, their hands clenched together. In the next frame, the grandfather appears, his face obscured by motion blur, his outline rigid, one arm raised as if he's about to speak or strike. The final photo is of the ground, likely snapped by accident during her abrupt departure. Evelyn's notes are initially calm, describing the landscape, the poverty, the eerie stillness of the hollow. But by the second day, her tone shifts. She writes, "There is something wrong with the boys. They speak in fragments, in unfinished sentences. They won't let go of each other's hands. When I asked if they had a mother, they both pointed to the same tree." She tried to report what she saw, but the local office dismissed her. No one wanted to stir up another scandal in the hills. They told her to drop it, to move on, and to focus on families that could still be helped. But Evelyn returned twice. On her final visit, she stayed the night. Her last journal entry reads, "There is something in the way they breathe. It's like watching lungs that never learned how." She never returned to Louisville. Her body was never found. The case was quietly closed as a presumed accident. But there's one chilling detail no one could explain: her journal was wrapped in fabric from one of the twins' shirts. It smelled of earth and something faintly metallic. Blood, perhaps, or iron. The sheriff's deputy who filed the evidence resigned the same week. He told his wife they weren't raised by him, they were forged by him. What happened in that cabin between 1953 and 1954 has become the core of local myth. A mix of fear, memory, and whatever truth still clings to rotting wood. There's a story passed down through 3 generations of the Langford family, who lived closest to the edge of the hollow. One morning in the spring of '54, the youngest son, Caleb, now in his 80s, says he saw smoke rising from the trees where the old man's cabin should have been. It wasn't thick like a fire, just a slow, curling haze that hung in the sky as if it didn't want to leave. He rode his mule halfway up the hill, then stopped. The air smelled strange, like wet copper and mold. He says he heard a sound he never forgot, not quite a scream, something more hollow, like grief trying to find a voice. That same week, the county clerk received an anonymous package. Inside, on a single typed sheet of paper, with no return address or signature, were 14 words. The blood went in circles. The twins were never meant to see the sun. A federal team, mostly unfamiliar with the landscape and guided by incomplete maps and shaky reports, searched the area 2 weeks later. The cabin had been burned, not from the outside, but from the inside out, as if it had imploded. No bodies were found, only fragments, a jawbone, a child's shoe, several teeth, all from the same mouth. But 2 small impressions in the ash puzzled the team, 2 sets of bare footprints, walking side by side toward the creek bed before vanishing into the mud. The grandfather was never seen again. The twins were never found. But the stories continued. In 1956, a hunter claimed he saw them by moonlight, standing in the shallows of a creek, their arms linked, their faces turned toward the water. When he shouted, they vanished. In '62, a retired teacher passing through said she met 2 silent boys hitchhiking near Pikeville, their skin pale as chalk, their eyes never blinking. She offered them a ride, and one whispered, "We're going back." Each of these stories ended the same way: no proof, no names, just a memory too strange to retell without trembling. By the time the 1970s arrived, the twins had become folklore. Parents warned their children not to wander too deep into the woods after dusk, lest the Demira boys find them. Campfire tales spread through eastern Kentucky like ash on the wind, stories of children hearing whispers in the trees and 2 identical figures staring through cabin windows, unmoving even when spotted. Some thought they were ghosts. Others believed they were something worse, not dead, not living, just left behind. But not everyone dismissed the past as myth. One man didn't. Dr. Marshall Greaves was a retired psychiatrist from Ohio who moved to the area in 1971 for the quiet. Or so he said. In truth, he had come because of Evelyn Cross. She had been his student once, and her disappearance haunted him. He believed the stories, or at least enough of them, to start digging. He rented a small home outside Hyden and spent years collecting anything tied to the twins, interviews, hospital records, police reports, and handwritten testimonies from elderly neighbors. What he found disturbed him, not because it proved what happened, but because so much of it had been deliberately erased. Greaves noticed something few others had seen. There were missing family records in the county's birth registries, entire branches of one bloodline that seemed to vanish after 1912. And when he traced those names backward, they all led to a single family, the Merriweathers. One branch had migrated into the mountains after a scandal involving inappropriate relations between siblings. By 1920, no male heirs remained. On paper, they had vanished. But Greaves believed otherwise. He claimed that the twins were not just inbred, but the product of several generations of closed-loop reproduction, each generation folding inward like paper, a genetic spiral into deformity, silence, and possible psychosis. The grandfather, Greaves believed, was not a guardian. He was an architect, the final bricklayer in a structure made of flesh and madness. Before he could publish his findings, Greaves disappeared. His trailer was found empty, the door wide open. On the kitchen table, all his files were stacked neatly, with one photograph left on top, a photo of two boys standing in a shallow creek, arms locked, heads tilted toward the camera, their eyes reflecting no light. There's a strange weight to silence, the kind that accumulates over years, compounding until it feels like pressure in the soil. That's what remains of the twin story now. Not evidence, not memory, just a heavy presence. In 1992, a new road construction project outside Hyden required deep excavation into the hills. Workers unearthed what they thought were animal bones. When the state anthropologist arrived, he determined they belonged to at least 3 human children, none older than 10. The skulls were misshapen, the teeth in irregular patterns, some fused at the jaw. There were no matching missing persons reports, no cause of death, no graves nearby, just buried together as if the earth itself had tried to smother the memory. One forensic assistant, who later quit the field entirely, described the skulls as too similar to be a coincidence, too wrong to be twins. She noted an anomaly, a shallow carving on one of the jawbones, a faint symbol resembling an infinity loop, etched post-mortem with something sharp. The file was closed as indeterminate historical remains, but the local community knew better. They didn't say it out loud, but you could see it in their eyes. The Langfords moved away that year. So did the Barlow families who had lived there for generations. When asked why, most just said, "It's time to go." But stories never truly die. They rot. They warp. In 2007, hikers found a crude wooden cross half buried near the creek where the twins were last seen. Tied to it with rusted wire was a pair of children's shoes, perfectly preserved, the kind worn in the 1950s. Scrawled into the wood beneath them were the words, "Same blood, same soul, same end." No one ever claimed responsibility. A private investigator hired by a true crime podcast in 2013 traced the story of the twins through whispered interviews and unlisted death certificates. His conclusion was simple and terrifying: the family hadn't ended. It had simply gone deeper, off the grid, into the hollows where names are traded like rumors and the past isn't dead, it's just breathing under floorboards. Maybe the twins never died. Maybe they weren't even twins in the way we understand. Perhaps they were the last visible part of something much older, a lineage hidden in plain sight, folded in on itself so many times that it created something unrecognizable. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what you would have done if this was your bloodline. The last known sighting was in 2019. A government drone surveying for fire risks over a remote portion of the Kentucky wilderness captured a 15-second video. Officials dismissed the footage as inconclusive wildlife imagery. But a technician who leaked the clip before being fired insisted it showed something else: 2 figures, thin and barefoot, moving slowly through the underbrush with unnatural synchronicity. Their heads were tilted the same way, their arms swinging in unison. Even in low-resolution grayscale, there was something deeply wrong about their movement, too precise, too mirrored, as if they weren't walking, but performing. No follow-up search was ever conducted. The footage vanished from the public record 2 weeks later. But that technician didn't stop looking. In an anonymous forum post just before he disappeared, he wrote, "It's not that they survived, it's that someone wanted them to." He claimed he found evidence of mail routed through rural post offices under the Merriweather name, all sent from different addresses, none traceable to real homes, all within a 40-mile radius of the cabin's remains. And then, silence. We are left with fragments, scraps of bone, photographs with hollow stares, burned journals, and second-hand stories passed like an infection through Appalachian bloodlines. But no final answer, no grave, no confirmed death. Just the persistent, heavy impression that something was born in that hollow and never left. A grandfather whose records don't exist. A pair of boys who may never have been boys at all. A family tree with no branches, just a loop twisted into flesh and fed across generations like a sickness. They say the past dies if you don't speak of it. But not this one. This story clings like smoke in old wood, like fingerprints beneath peeling wallpaper. The more you try to forget it, the deeper it settles. And maybe that's the real horror, not what happened, but how easy it is for the earth to hide it. Somewhere out there, in the quietest folds of America, there are still places where the blood runs in circles and no one comes looking. You've just heard one of them, and now you know what you weren't supposed to.